Hello and welcome to the Whole Life Matters podcast. I am Lynn Cush with Young Pro-Life Democrats. We are high school and college-age individuals committed to be the progressive voice for life as we advocate for universal human rights and push for a consistent life ethic within the Democratic Party. Today we welcome Sophie Trist to speak to us about ableism and its intersectionality with abortion. So, can you tell me a little bit about who you are and your story?
Yeah, so my name is Sophie Trist. I'm from Louisiana. I graduated from Loyola University of New Orleans in 2020. And in the fall, I'm going to be pursuing an MFA in creative writing. I became active in the pro-life movement my freshman year of college when my best friend asked me if I wanted to help resurrect the pro-life student group at our university. Mm-hmm. Before that, I grew up, saying I was pro-life, but I was never really involved. So through helping to start that club, I just said yes without really thinking about it, and it turned out to be one of the best decisions in my life. And that's how I became introduced to the consistent life ethic and New Wave Feminists and Rehumanize International and eventually DFLA. And after I graduated college and I was still looking for ways to stay involved in the whole life movement, I became the Democrats for Life messaging director.
Thank you so much for telling me that. Can you explain what ableism is and how it affects the disabled community?
Yeah, so ableism, it's really simple. It's any kind of prejudice or discrimination against people with disabilities. It can take many forms. Disabled people tend to be vastly either unemployed or underemployed. And a lot of that is due to systemic inequalities and low expectations. A lot of disabled people are told that they are not capable or that their lives aren't worth as much as a non-disabled person's. And so there are a couple of ways of looking at disability. What we call the medical model basically says your body or your mind are the problem and you need to be cured in order to participate in society. But the model that we subscribe to is more of a social or disability justice model, which kind of says that society's definition of normal and healthy is way too narrow, and that it's the lack of understanding and accommodation that causes most of our problems. Yeah. Sort of related, sorry, I kind of am going all over the place a little bit.
Really good.
Going back to what I said, and I have dogs. Sorry about that too.
Oh, you're fine.
Going back to what I said about many disabled people having low expectations, or people having low expectations of us, is what we in the community like to call inspiration porn. So anytime you see a story about, this kind-hearted teenager inviting a disabled student to prom, that is a form of ableism that we call inspiration porn, because it acts like disabled people participating in society is something exceptional and amazing and not something that can just happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
And a lot of times those stories tend to be skewed more toward, look at how awesome this non-disabled person is, going out of their way to include this poor person. So it kind of sets the bar for a very low expectation.
Yeah. So you talked about like systemic ableism type things. Are there any like policies or guidelines that contribute to that we should be aware of?
There are several. One of the most pervasive in the US is the way that disability medical benefits are structured.
Mm-hmm.
And the way those work is that if a disabled person's monthly income rises above $2,000, they will lose their government disability health benefits. So this prevents disabled people from marrying. It often restricts them from working. It basically says if you want the health care that keeps you alive, you have to live in poverty forever.
Yeah.
That's one really horrible example. Another one is there is a loophole in the Fair Labor Standards Act, which allows companies to get certificates that let them pay workers with disabilities under the minimum wage. So you have disabled people in these, we call them sheltered workshops, making, in some cases, literally cents on the hour, basically is being exploited. So those, I mean, I'm sure there are more, but those are kind of two big legal systemic instances of ableism that are pervasive. Another one that I think it's fair to touch on, given the venue, is right to die laws. I don't know how familiar you are with that. But right to die laws are problematic because they're becoming ever more permissive, especially in countries like Europe and Canada. In fact, Canada has passed a law that allows disability to be grounds for euthanasia. Wow. So it starts with, terminal illness, if you have 6 months or less to live. And everyone is like, I might not agree with that, but I can understand it. But it is becoming ever more permissive, and people being euthanized just for having a disability, and that inherently devalues our lives. Actually, something that made me very happy, and I don't think it got nearly the attention in the disability community that it should, was the UN recently came out against allowing disability to be grounds for euthanasia. The UN's Office of Human Rights said it would basically be institutionalizing ableism, which I thought was really powerful and has been talked about more.
Yeah, that's really good that the UN did that.
By the way, if I ever talk, because this is something I can talk about for a long time, so if you ever need to move on, just cut me off.
Oh no, you are totally good. This is so much good information. So young pro-life Democrats, we also talk a lot about abortion. And so ableism and abortion, like, how do they intersect? How do those go together?
So I actually love this question because it's the connection between disability and abortion is what sparked my pro-life writing career. It was what I wrote my first secular pro-life piece about. So my argument is that abortion is inherently ableist. And I say that because abortion makes autonomy and independence the right inherent for the right to life. It makes someone's right to live based on, can you live alone? Are you convenient to someone else? It's the same might makes right mentality that people with disabilities have been striving against, to be granted the right to life, not based on our autonomy and what we can do, but based on our humanity, because that should be all that's required.
Yeah.
That said, abortion and disability are connected in some really specific and horrifying ways. There was a new study that just came out earlier in 2021, which found that 82% of doctors hold negative views of disability, and only 40% of physicians believe that they can offer disabled people the same quality of care, because they believe that our quality of life is much lower than it actually is. Wow. So what this leads to an abortion is at least some of these 82% of doctors are going to be OBGYNs or genetic counselors. Yeah. And if these negative ableist views, they're going to be encouraging or strongly recommending termination and emphasizing the worst case scenarios, as versus, hey, let me put you in touch with a support group of people who actually live with this disability, so that you get a more realistic view of what you can expect. The Down syndrome abortion rates, and we talked about these because they're the disabilities that we have the most statistics for. The rates in Iceland and some other European countries are as high as like 98%.
Oh my God.
The US is lower, but it's still really bad at like 67% of Down's babies are killed. And just things that I've heard, like someone once asked a friend of mine, well, I'm really surprised that Sophie is against abortion. You know, I would think he would be for abortion because it prevents disabled people like her from suffering.
Oh my goodness.
I heard of another incident where a student was in class and the professor was talking about spina bifida. And I forget what the exact words were, but the gist was that kids with that condition should be terminated. And that's like the acceptable or even merciful option. The atheist thinker and scientist Richard Dawkins has gone so far as to say that people with prenatal diagnosis have a moral duty to abort disabled babies.
Gosh, that is so terrible. What are some ways that we can open our eyes to ableism? I mean, you've explained what ableism is and like be aware and fight against the ableism around us.
So if you don't take anything else that I say from this, I want it to be listen to disabled people. Like, honestly, get that tattooed on your forehead because it's the most important thing that you can do to fight against ableism. It's like if you want to fight racism, listen to people of color.
Yeah.
Because we know our experiences better than the non-disabled people who will try to speak for us. Follow disabled activists and creators, even if you don't agree with everything they say, you're still going to get a lot of really valuable insights.
Yeah.
Follow and support disability rights organizations that actually have disabled people in leadership roles.
Yeah.
I cannot stress that enough. Research disability history. Learn about the eugenics movement. Learn about the Nazi genocide of disabled people. Learn about ways that we've been harmed in the past and ways that we're being harmed now. Funny that our interview is on this day, because it's actually the anniversary of one of the most important events in American disability rights history.
What is that event?
So in 1977, disabled people peacefully occupied a government building in San Francisco to protest for the enforcement of anti-discrimination regulations that had been written into law, they just weren't being enforced.
Yeah.
So the sit-in was actually the start of a 28-day peaceful protest. It was, for a while, it was one of the longest nonviolent sit-ins in the country. Wow. And it was by disabled people. And no one knows about it.
Yeah, that needs to be more public. We should talk about that more in the news.
And you know, we talked about the bus boycotts and the, you know, hunger strikes of the suffragists. And those are all great things. But this gets overlooked.
Yeah.
So just learning and talking about that can go a long way.
Yeah. How do you think the pandemic specifically has exposed ableism and the lack of healthcare and accessibility in society?
So I'm gonna try not to go on for 7 hours, but no promises. There was a lot of really scary rhetoric, particularly in the early months of the pandemic. This idea that, oh, well, it's only older people and disabled people who are going to die, so who cares? And this idea that we should sacrifice our lives, not even for the greater good, although that's problematic as well, but that we should be willing to die to get the economy going again, or so that you can get a haircut or a hamburger. Just that disabled lives are worth so little to some people.
Oh my gosh.
And obviously, we saw the healthcare rationing protocols that were really frightening, that people would divert, resources away from disabled COVID-19 patients. The case of Michael Hickson garnered a lot of attention because he was taken off life support despite his wife's protests, because his quality of life was deemed to be so low. And again, his quality of life is so subjective. I don't trust any non-disabled person who talks about quality of life. I really don't.
Yeah.
There were some less lethal but still horrible ableist structures during the pandemic. 48 of the 50 states had coronavirus websites that were at least partly inaccessible to blind people.
Yeah.
A lot of information about the pandemic was displayed very visually in like charts and graphs. Again, making it inaccessible to blind people and making us having to rely on sketchy secondhand information.
Yeah.
The lack of ASL interpreters at early press conferences. Drive-through testing sites. I can't drive.
Yeah.
And that's not only discriminating against disabled people, but also low-income people without cars.
Yeah.
And even with the vaccine effort, it's going really well, but it's also leaving disabled people behind in a lot of ways. In a lot of states, immunocompromised people were not prioritized, even though there have been data showing that an immunocompromised person is more likely to die than an older person.
Yeah.
They were kind of just left behind and not prioritized. And also, again, just with the accessibility problems, the websites and systems to even get an appointment are very convoluted.
Yeah.
And for disabled people or elderly people, they are really hard to navigate.
Yeah.
That limits our access to vaccines. And that kind of brings me to another important point, which is universal design. So that's the idea that instead of having to adapt all these systems like, pandemic websites and pandemic vaccine appointment systems, instead of having to adapt them on the fly and figure out how to do it, let's build them with disabled people in mind.
Yeah.
So that if our needs are considered in the design process, then things can just come out of the box accessible. Apple is doing a really good job of this. Do you have an iPhone?
Yes.
So, did you know that your iPhone has screen reading technology on it?
Oh, really?
If you go under settings on your iPhone, And if you go under accessibility, you'll see a bunch of different programs built in for all different types of disabilities, blindness, hearing impairment, other sensory disabilities. So those are built into the iPhone right out the box.
Yeah.
You can literally get an iPhone in the store, and in 5 minutes, you can have it working.
Yeah.
So what I mean when I say build with accessibility in mind, it doesn't have to detract from the technology if it's built.
You kind of talk about this like with building in mind, so like the country's infrastructure. How has ableism affected that, and why is accessibility so important to the growth of our nation?
I mean, universal design covered what I have to say about infrastructure a lot. I don't have tons of experience with public transit other than airplanes. I mean, the fact that our roads and bridges are falling apart impacts disabled people just like it impacts everyone else. We're relying on the same systems to get around, except things might even be more difficult for us. I guess some things that we should think about would just be like, making sure that pedestrian areas are wheelchair friendly, making sure that electric cars or quiet cars make enough noise so that a blind person coming down the street can hear them.
Yeah.
Again, if we broaden what we think of as normal and healthy, then we'll broaden what we're building into our technology, and it won't be, this anomalous thing that we have to cover at the last second. It'll be his second nature.
Yeah. Also, there's lots of ableism in schools, specifically like non-compliance with 504 plans, IEPs, and attendance policies. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that's obviously going to be very widely by school district and the individual administrators. As a general rule, private schools are exempt from 504 and IDEA requirements.
Oh, wow.
So that's why I went to public school, even though my whole family went to Catholic school.
Yeah.
That said, I have spoken at IEPs for other blind students where they were being obstinate about giving them Braille and other services. And again, a lot of it goes back to low expectations.
Yeah.
It's important to not push disabled people beyond what they can do, but it's also important to not assume that because a student has a disability that they're not going to be able to accomplish anything academically.
Yeah.
Maintaining the balance of, yes, college is important and great and wonderful, but maybe let's work a little more on acknowledging students who aren't college bound.
Yeah.
And recognizing their achievements, and that's not the only way to be worthy and succeed in life.
Yeah.
Attendance policies, I don't have too much to say about that, other than to say that perfect attendance is problematic because it basically rewards students for being healthy.
Yeah.
And like, is that really the metric that we want to use to measure success?
Yeah. Are there any other things that you would like to talk about ableism, or anything else that you would like to share with us?
I guess if you see something, call it out. If you see someone, grabbing a disabled person without asking them, and by the way, that includes any kind of mobility aids like
Yeah.
canes or dogs or wheelchairs, call it out.
Yeah.
Because, we're counting on you to be allies as well. That's why I'm saying, like, learn what ableism is, what forms it takes, learn about the history. That way you'll be able to spot it.
Yeah.
When you see disability portrayed in the media, is it a realistic, nuanced interpretation, or is it a harmful, one-dimensional stereotype?
Yeah.
And one thing that I would be remiss if I didn't speak about a little bit is every day on March 1st, the Disability marks or commemorates, I guess is the right word, the Disability Day of Mourning. And what that is it speaks to disabled people who were killed by their caregivers, because it's a mercy killing, or I just don't want to deal with this burden anymore. And the media often couches these acts of murder in very sympathetic language. It's like, well, oh, it's horrible that that person was killed, but their caregiver didn't have any support, or they didn't know, we don't know what they were going through, so it was a mercy to kill them. So just looking at that erasure of the victim in favor of the murderer.
Yeah.
And not that I'm advocating for the death penalty or like dehumanizing anyone.
Yeah.
But just to be aware of when you see that you can have the knowledge to call it out.
Thank you for tuning in to the Whole Life Matters podcast. I am Lynn Kosh, and we are Young Pro-Life Democrats. You can find us on Instagram and on our website at ypld.democratsforlife.org. Be sure to join us again as we learn more about whole life issues.